For 34 years, I never went down to my husband's basement. He said there were dangerous chemicals down there, veterinary supplies that could be harmful if touched. I respected that. I was a good wife. I trusted him. Until that night when the power went out, and I had no choice but to descend those stairs. There, behind an old cabinet, I found a small key. And that key destroyed everything I thought I knew about my life. My husband was the most beloved man in our town. He sang hymns at church every Sunday. He healed animals with gentle hands. Our neighbors called him a saint. The local paper once ran a story about his volunteer work at the animal shelter. I cut it out and framed it. I was so proud. For 34 years I shared a bed with a monster. I made him breakfast every morning. I raised his children. I grew old beside him. And I never knew what he truly was. My name is Dr. Sarah Bennett. I've been a clinical psychologist for 22 years. In all that time, I've heard countless stories of trauma, betrayal, and human darkness. But when Linda walked into my office 3 months after her husband's arrest, carrying the weight of a truth too terrible to bear alone, I realized I had never truly understood the depths of what one person can hide from another, or the courage it takes to expose that darkness to the light. Linda sat across from me, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. She was 56 years old, a retired elementary school teacher, a mother of 3 grown sons, a grandmother of 5. By all appearances, she should have been enjoying her golden years, tending her garden, spoiling her grandchildren, traveling with her husband to places they'd always dreamed of visiting. Instead, she looked like someone who had aged a decade in the span of 3 months. Deep lines carved around her mouth, dark circles beneath the eyes that had forgotten how to sleep, a tremor in her hands that spoke of nerves stretched past their breaking point. But what struck me most wasn't her exhaustion. It was the way her eyes kept darting to the door. Not like she wanted to escape, like she was checking to make sure no one was following her, like she was waiting for someone to burst through and drag her back to a life she no longer recognized. After 34 years of living with a predator without knowing it, that hypervigilance had become as natural as breathing. Her nervous system had finally caught up to a danger that had been present all along. In some sessions, my patients heal as they speak. The words come out, and with them, the poison drains away. But some stories are different. Some stories lodge themselves in my mind like splinters that can never be fully removed. Today, I'm sharing one of those lives with you. If you're listening to this and there are things inside you that you can't hold anymore, share what you're feeling in the comments and tell me where you're listening from. I read every comment, I hear every story. If you want to stay updated on the therapy stories don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If this story touches your heart, you can support me by liking. One day, I'd love to hear your story too. If you want me to share your story in my next video, you can send it to the email address in my profile. Remember, our stories heal, even just a little, when they're shared. The first thing Linda said to me wasn't about her husband. It wasn't about the basement or the key or the horror she'd uncovered. It wasn't about the trial that had consumed the nation's attention for months. "I keep washing my hands," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Over and over, 20, 30 times a day. But they never feel clean, they never feel like mine." She held them up for me to see. The skin was raw, cracked in places, angry red from countless scrubbings with scalding water. The cuticles were torn. One nail had been scrubbed down so far it was bleeding. This wasn't about hygiene. This was about trying to scrub away 34 years of unknowing complicity. Every time she looked at her hands, she saw them making dinner for a murderer, folding his laundry, reaching for him in the night. What I observed in Linda was a classic manifestation of contamination anxiety, a symptom often seen in trauma survivors who feel tainted by the proximity to evil. Her compulsive hand-washing wasn't about cleanliness. It was a desperate physical attempt to purge herself of guilt she couldn't process emotionally. The damaged skin told the story her words couldn't yet articulate. She felt marked by association, corrupted by contact, stained by a love that had turned out to be a lie. Her hands had touched him for 34 years. Now she wanted to scour away every memory of that touch. Would you like to tell me about what happened? I asked gently, keeping my voice soft and unhurried. In moments like these, the therapist's tone becomes an anchor, something steady in a sea of chaos. Linda's jaw tightened. I watched the muscles cord in her neck, the slight forward hunch of her shoulders, as if she were physically bracing herself against something. Her gaze dropped to the floor, to a spot on the carpet she seemed to find fascinating. For almost 2 full minutes she said nothing. The silence in my office grew heavy, thick with unspoken horror. I let it stretch. Sometimes the silence itself is the beginning of healing, a space where the unspeakable can gather its courage to become words. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, roughened by tears shed and tears held back, "Where do you even begin when your whole life turns out to be a lie? When every memory you have is contaminated? When you look back at 34 years and realize you were never living the life you thought you were living?" I leaned forward slightly, closing the distance between us without invading her space. "You begin wherever feels right. There's no wrong place to start. No judgment here, just 2 people and a story that needs to be told." She took a shaky breath, the kind that rattles in the chest, the kind that precedes either words or sobs. When she spoke, her voice cracked on every other word. "Everyone keeps asking me how I didn't know. The FBI agents, the prosecutors, the reporters who camped on my lawn for weeks, my neighbors who I thought were my friends." She swallowed hard. "My own children, my daughter, my Sarah, she won't even speak to me anymore. She thinks I must have known. She thinks I was protecting him all those years. She thinks I'm as guilty as he is." Linda looked up at me then, and in her eyes, I saw something that would haunt me for weeks. The desperate, pleading look of someone who needed to be believed, who had been doubted by everyone she loved, who was starting to doubt herself. "I didn't know," she said, and her voice broke completely. "I swear to God I didn't know. I swear on my children's lives, on everything I've ever held sacred. I did not know what he was." But there was something else in those eyes. A flicker of something she hadn't yet admitted, even to herself. Something buried so deep that bringing it to light would require more courage than she knew she possessed. A small, terrible question. Should I have known? The guilt Linda carried was a complex tapestry woven from societal judgment, self-blame, and what we call secondary traumatization. The trauma of discovering you've been intimately connected to someone who has committed atrocities. When a spouse discovers their partner is a predator, they often experience what psychologists term betrayal blindness, the mind's protective mechanism that prevents us from seeing evidence that would shatter our fundamental sense of reality. Linda's psyche had protected her for 34 years, filtering out the small inconsistencies and strange moments that might have revealed the truth. Now that protection had been stripped away and she was left raw and exposed to the full weight of retrospective awareness, seeing, in hindsight, 1,000 small signs she had unconsciously chosen not to see. To understand what Linda lost and what she never truly had, you first need to understand what she thought her life was, the picture she had built in her mind, the story she had told herself for more than 3 decades. She met Harold in the summer of 1989. She was 22 years old, fresh out of college with a teaching degree, full of hope and idealism and the naive belief that the world was essentially good. He was 27, already established as the town's only veterinarian, known throughout the community for his gentle way with animals and his warm, reassuring smile. "He was so kind," Linda told me, her voice taking on a distant quality as she drifted back through the years. "The first time we met, I brought in a stray cat I'd found by the road. It was badly hurt. Hit by a car, probably. Most of its ribs were broken. It was bleeding internally. Any sensible vet would have suggested putting it down." She shifted in her chair, her fingers intertwining and releasing, intertwining and releasing. "But Harold, he stayed up all night with that cat. He performed surgery in his little clinic, with just a technician to help. He called me the next morning to tell me the cat had made it. He'd named her Lucky." A ghost of a smile crossed her face, then vanished like morning frost. I fell in love with him in that moment, a man who would work through the night to save a stray cat. How could he be anything but good? She looked at me, and something dark passed over her face like a cloud obscuring the sun. Now I wonder, was that even real? Was the kindness genuine, or was it just another performance? Was he already hunting by then? Was he sitting in that clinic saving that cat's life while thinking about the woman he'd hurt the week before? They married 6 months later, a small ceremony at the local Presbyterian church, followed by a reception in the town hall where everyone knew everyone. Linda wore her mother's wedding dress, ivory silk with delicate lace at the collar. Harold cried during the vows. Everyone said they were the perfect couple, the dedicated teacher and the compassionate veterinarian, the pillars of their small community. Their first child, Michael, was born in 1991. Linda remembered the way Harold held him in the delivery room, so gentle, so overcome with emotion that he couldn't speak. Then came David in 1993, and finally Thomas in 1996. Linda left teaching to raise their children, and Harold's practice grew. They bought a beautiful Victorian house on the edge of town, the kind with a wraparound porch, mature oak trees in the yard, and a full basement that stretched the entire length of the house, and the basement that Harold claimed for his home office and veterinary archives. He told me he kept old case files down there, Linda said, her voice mechanical, reciting facts she had repeated to investigators, lawyers, and herself hundreds of times. Medical records from difficult cases, specimens for research, chemicals for treating animals, sedatives, euthanasia drugs, things that could be dangerous if mishandled. He said it wasn't safe for me or the kids. She laughed then, a bitter, broken sound that held no humor whatsoever. And I believed him. For 34 years, I believed every word. I never questioned it. What kind of wife doesn't question something like that? What kind of woman lives above a chamber of horrors and never once thinks to look? Linda's self-blame was serving as a defense mechanism. Paradoxically, a way to maintain some sense of control in a situation where control had been utterly stripped from her. By focusing on what she should have known or done, she was preserving the illusion that she could have prevented this, that there was some action she could have taken, some question she could have asked, because the alternative, accepting that she was completely powerless, that she was manipulated by a master deceiver, that love itself can be weaponized and trust turned into a trap, was far more terrifying. If she was at fault, then the world still made a kind of sense. If she was blameless, then evil could hide anywhere, in anyone, and there was no protection against it. The sign she missed, or did she? Over our next several sessions, Linda began to excavate her memories like an archaeologist sifting through ruins. She was searching for signs, for clues, for anything that might have warned her of the truth. The more she dug, the more she found, small things that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now glowed with sinister new meaning. He was always so particular about his schedule, she recalled, staring at the wall as if watching old home movies play across its surface. Every Wednesday evening without fail, he had a veterinary association meeting that ran until late. Every other weekend, there was a conference somewhere, Indianapolis, Columbus, Pittsburgh. I never questioned it. Why would I? He was a professional. Professionals have meetings. Professionals go to conferences. She shook her head slowly, her hands gripping the armrests of her chair. The FBI checked. There were no association meetings on Wednesday nights. Half those conferences didn't exist, and the ones that did, he never actually attended. He'd check into a hotel, and then he'd disappear for hours, sometimes days. What Linda was describing is a common pattern among predators who lead double lives. They create elaborate cover stories, develop consistent alibis, and exploit their partner's trust to operate with impunity. Harold's professional obligations were never questioned because they fit perfectly with his identity as a dedicated veterinarian. Linda had no framework for suspicion. She was married to a man everyone admired, a man whose entire public persona was built on kindness and healing. The disconnect between that persona and reality was simply too vast for her mind to bridge without evidence forcing her hand. She told me about the time early in their marriage when she'd gone to the basement to retrieve Christmas decorations. It was the winter of 1992. Michael was just a toddler, and Linda wanted to make his second Christmas special. Harold had caught her halfway down the stairs. He didn't yell, Linda said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Harold never yelled, That wasn't his way. He was always calm, always controlled. But when he saw me on those stairs, his face changed, just for a second. Less than a second, I saw something in his eyes that I'd never seen before. She clutched her hands together so tightly that her knuckles went white. It was cold, empty, like looking into a window and realizing there's nothing behind it. Like looking at a person and realizing there's no person there, just something wearing a person's face. She shivered at the memory, wrapping her arms around herself as if the room had suddenly gone cold. Then it was gone. He smiled, apologized for startling me, said he'd get the decorations himself because he didn't want me navigating those steep stairs while holding things. He was so considerate, so reasonable, and I never tried to go down there again. Not in 32 years. This moment was psychologically critical, a junction point where Linda's instincts had detected danger and sent up a warning flare. That brief flash of coldness in Harold's eyes had triggered her threat detection system, that ancient part of our brain that evolved to recognize predators. But because the threat disappeared as quickly as it appeared, and because acknowledging it would have meant questioning her entire reality, her marriage, her husband, the father of her child, her conscious mind filed it away under strange but not important. This is precisely how sophisticated predators maintain their double lives. They develop an exquisite sensitivity to their own masks, instantly course-correcting whenever they slip, leaving their partners with only fleeting glimpses that are easy to dismiss or explain away. There were other moments too, times when Harold would come home late, strip off his clothes, wait and shower immediately, sometimes twice, claiming he'd been dealing with a particularly messy emergency case. Times when he'd seem distracted at dinner looking at something Linda couldn't see, answering questions a beat too late. Times when she'd wake in the night and find his side of the bed empty, and he'd say he couldn't sleep, that he'd been watching television even though the TV was cold to the touch. Times when she'd catch him staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not angry, not loving, something else entirely, something that made her feel just for a moment like an object being assessed rather than a wife being loved. I thought he was stressed, Linda said, her voice thick with bitter irony. I thought maybe he was unhappy in our marriage and didn't know how to tell me. I thought he might be having an affair. I thought 100 different things. She looked at me with eyes that had seen too much. But I never thought, I never imagined, I couldn't have imagined. She couldn't finish the sentence. Some thoughts are too monstrous to complete. It was a Tuesday in October. The leaves had just started to turn, painting the hills around their town in shades of amber and crimson. Harold had left that morning for a 5-day veterinary conference in another state. One of the real ones, ironically, though he wouldn't actually attend any of the sessions. Linda was home alone. A rare occurrence after 34 years of marriage, after raising 3 boys, after decades of being someone's wife and someone's mother, and rarely, if ever, just herself. I was actually looking forward to it, she admitted, a flicker of guilt crossing her face even now. Sometime to myself, I was going to read those books that had been piling up on my nightstand. Maybe call my sister for a long chat, just enjoy the quiet. She had no idea that by the end of the week, she would never know quiet again. Around 9 in the evening, a storm rolled in from the west. Thunder shook the old Victorian house, rattling windows in their frames. Lightning turned night to day and back again, and then, with a crack louder than thunder, the power went out. Darkness swallowed the house whole. I knew the fuse box was in the basement, Linda said, her voice tight. I'd always known that. It was in the far corner, near Harold's desk. But I'd also always called Harold whenever there was an electrical problem. He'd go down and fix it. That was just how things worked. That was the arrangement we'd somehow fallen into without ever discussing it. But Harold was 500 miles away, and Linda was sitting in complete darkness, alone in a storm with no one to call. She found a flashlight in the kitchen drawer and made her way through the dark house to the basement door. Her hand hesitated on the doorknob, actually hesitated, she told me, as if some part of her already knew what waited below. It sounds crazy, but I actually felt guilty, she told me. Like I was betraying his trust by going down there, violating some sacred boundary, 34 years of conditioning, I suppose. 34 years of being trained to stay away. She opened the door. The hinges creaked. They always did. Harold had never gotten around to oiling them. The smell of must and old paper drifted up from below. Linda descended into the darkness. What Linda described as conditioning was actually a sophisticated form of psychological control that Harold had maintained throughout their marriage. By establishing the basement as his exclusive territory and consistently reinforcing that boundary through subtle emotional cues, that flash of coldness, the gentle redirections, the ever-present excuse of dangerous chemicals, he had created a powerful taboo in Linda's mind. Her guilt at violating this taboo, even when her husband was hundreds of miles away and she had a perfectly legitimate reason to go down there, speaks to how deeply ingrained these patterns of control had become. She had internalized his rules so completely that she felt like a trespasser in her own home. The basement was exactly what Harold had always described: shelves lined with old veterinary files, their labels faded and yellowing, boxes of supplies, syringes, bandages, bottles of medications with expiration dates long past, a desk in one corner with an old computer, its screen dark, a filing cabinet, a worn office chair, a faint smell of antiseptic and dust. Nothing unusual, nothing sinister, just the mundane clutter of a veterinarian's home workspace. Linda found the fuse box in the far corner, just where she knew it would be. The breaker had tripped. She reset it, and the lights flickered back on, both in the basement and, she assumed, throughout the house above. She should have left then. She almost did. Her foot was on the first stair. "But I dropped the flashlight," she said, her voice taking on a strange, distant quality. "My hands were shaking, from the storm, I told myself, or from being in the basement for the first time." The flashlight slipped from my fingers and rolled across the concrete floor. It went under one of the old cabinets against the wall, the kind that sits on little legs with a gap underneath. She knelt down to retrieve it. Her fingers touched the cold metal of the flashlight, and then they touched something else. A key. Small, silver, taped to the back of the cabinet with a single strip of yellowed masking tape, hidden in the shadows where no one would ever see it unless they happened to be reaching for a dropped flashlight on a stormy October night. "I almost left it there," Linda whispered. "I almost just let it be. It was probably nothing," I told myself, "a spare key to something long forgotten. Old houses are full of mysterious keys to forgotten locks." She held her breath for a moment, lost in the memory. But something made me take it. Some instinct I'd been suppressing for 34 years, some small, quiet voice that had been trying to warn me for decades, finally loud enough to hear. She pocketed the key and went back upstairs. That night she sat in the living room while the storm raged outside, staring at the small silver key in her palm. It seemed so innocent, so ordinary, just a key, but it felt heavy, heavier than any key should feel, as if it held the weight of secrets. Harold would be home in 4 days. The discovery of that key represented a critical psychological threshold. Linda's entire sense of reality hung in the balance. Part of her desperately wanted to believe there was an innocent explanation, a key to a safe deposit box perhaps, or an old storage unit Harold had forgotten about. Another part of her, the part that had noticed those fleeting moments of coldness over the years, knew that this key unlocked something far more terrible. This internal conflict would torment her for the next several days, a war between the comfort of ignorance and the terrible necessity of truth. The next morning, Linda found herself back in the basement. She told herself she was just looking for what the key might open, a logical explanation, a reason to stop the growing dread that had taken root in her stomach and was spreading its tendrils through her entire body. She searched for hours, methodically, carefully. The key didn't fit the filing cabinet, it didn't fit the desk drawers, it didn't fit any lock she could find, but she found something else. In an old shoebox tucked behind veterinary textbooks from the 1990s, there was a pink hair clip, child-sized, the kind a little girl might wear. It was faded, the plastic cracked with age. "We never had a daughter," Linda told me, her voice hollow as an empty room. 3 boys. No daughters. No granddaughters either. Not back then anyway. My sons were still single. There was no little girl in our lives. There hadn't been for decades. She stared at that pink clip, trying to convince herself there was an explanation. Maybe it belonged to a client's child who had visited the clinic. Maybe it had been in the house when they bought it. Maybe it was left behind by a previous owner. Maybe. She put it back and went upstairs. That night she made dinner, a casserole she'd made 1,000 times before. She watched television, some show she couldn't remember 5 minutes later. She went through all the motions of a normal evening, but her mind was in the basement, circling that pink hair clip like a vulture over carrion, wondering, fearing, knowing, on some level she couldn't yet access, that she was standing at the edge of an abyss. Linda was experiencing what we call cognitive dissonance at its most extreme, a state where the evidence of her senses was in direct conflict with her understanding of her husband and her life. Her mind was desperately trying to reconcile these two realities, generating increasingly improbable explanations to avoid confronting the truth. And this is not weakness. This is the human psyche attempting to protect itself from information that would fundamentally shatter its world. The cost of knowing was so high that her brain was willing to accept almost any alternative, no matter how implausible. By the third day, Linda couldn't stay away from the basement. She had become obsessive, returning again and again to search every corner, every drawer, every possible hiding place. Sleep had abandoned her. Food held no appeal. She moved through her house like a ghost, driven by a compulsion she couldn't name or resist. "I found a drawer with a false bottom," she said, "an old drawer in Harold's desk. It looked normal, but it felt too shallow for its depth. The measurements didn't match. I pried it open with a screwdriver." Her hands were trembling as she described what she found. Inside were 7 small objects, arranged in a neat row. A pair of silver earrings with tiny diamond chips, a delicate gold bracelet, a heart-shaped pendant on a broken chain, a keychain with a faded photo of a smiling young woman, an elastic hair tie still holding a few strands of dark hair, a simple gold band, a wedding ring, and that pink clip she'd found before. She realized it must have fallen out at some point, been carelessly replaced. Each item rested on a small piece of white paper. Each paper had a date written in Harold's neat handwriting. 7 objects, 7 dates, spanning 25 years of her marriage. "I told myself they were mementos," Linda said, her voice fracturing like thin ice. "From patients, from their pets' owners. Veterinarians must keep things like that, right? Sentimental reminders of animals they'd saved, grateful clients who'd given him little tokens of appreciation." She knew, even as she thought it, that it didn't make sense. And no veterinarian keeps earrings from clients. No one catalogs such items with dates written in careful script. No innocent explanation could account for a wedding ring in a hidden drawer. That night, Linda sat at her computer until 3 in the morning. She typed the first date into a search engine, along with their town's name and the word missing. The results loaded in seconds, and Linda's world ended. The moment Linda decided to search those dates marked her transition from passive victim to active investigator. This shift was crucial psychologically. It gave her a sense of agency in a situation where she felt utterly powerless. She was no longer waiting for truth to find her. She was hunting it herself. But this agency came at a terrible cost. Every search, every result, every confirmation of her worst fears drove another nail into the coffin of her old life. She was simultaneously solving a mystery and destroying everything she had built. The courage this required cannot be overstated. 1994, a young woman named Jessica Marlowe disappeared from a neighboring town. She was 23, a nursing student with her whole life ahead of her. The case went cold within months. Her parents never stopped searching. 1998, Amanda Chen, 26, was found dead in her apartment across the county line. Suicide, the coroner ruled, though her family insisted she had everything to live for. She'd just gotten engaged. She'd just been promoted at work. Why would she kill herself? 2003, college student Brianna Foster transferred to another school mid-semester and was never heard from again. Her roommate reported her missing, but the police assumed she'd simply dropped out. Her parents filed missing persons reports in 3 states. 2007, Carol Mitchell, 34, Linda's closest friend, moved to California without saying goodbye. Left a note saying she needed a fresh start, Never called, never wrote. Vanished completely from a life that by all accounts she had loved. Linda stopped reading. Her hands were shaking so violently that she could barely control the mouse. Carol. Her Carol. And the woman she'd had coffee with every Thursday's day for 8 years. The woman who'd helped her through postpartum depression after Thomas was born. The woman who'd held her hand during her mother's funeral. The woman who'd vanished in 2007, leaving only a brief note that never quite made sense. I called her number for months after she left, Linda whispered, tears streaming down her face. It just rang and rang. I sent letters to the address she'd given me in California. They came back, addressee unknown. I thought she just didn't want to be found. I thought maybe I'd done something wrong. I thought maybe our friendship hadn't meant as much to her as it meant to me. She looked at me with eyes that had witnessed the unthinkable. Her earrings were in that drawer, Dr. Bennett, the ones she always wore, little silver hoops with tiny diamond chips. Her mother had given them to her for her 30th birthday. She never took them off. Never. The weight of that realization that her best friend had been murdered by her husband, possibly in their own home, and she had spent 17 years believing Carol had simply moved away, was almost too much for Linda to bear. She collapsed in my office, sobbing with a grief that had been 17 years in the making. The revelation about Carol was the moment Linda's psychological defenses finally and completely collapsed. A stranger's disappearance could still be explained away, rationalized, held at arm's length. But Carol was real. Carol was someone Linda had loved deeply, mourned, and wondered about for nearly 2 decades. Carol's earrings, those familiar silver hoops that Linda had seen thousands of times, were undeniable proof that Harold had been involved in her friend's disappearance. The grief Linda experienced in that moment was compounded by 17 years of unknowing, 17 years of guilt about a friendship she thought had failed, when in reality, her friend had been silenced forever by the man sleeping beside her. Linda went back to the basement. One final time. She wasn't looking for explanations anymore. Those had evaporated like morning mist. She was looking for evidence. Evidence that would put Harold away forever, evidence that would bring some measure of justice to the women whose names were now burned into her memory. She found it behind a shelf unit against the far wall, a section of paneling that didn't quite match the rest, slightly newer, the wood grain running in a different direction. When she pushed on it, she felt it give slightly, like a door that hadn't been properly latched. The small silver key fit perfectly into a hidden lock. Behind the panel was a steel safe, the kind you might use to store important documents or valuables. Linda's hands trembled as she turned the key. Inside was 7 USB drives, each one labeled with a date, the same dates as the objects in the drawer. I almost didn't watch them, Linda told me, her voice barely audible. I almost just took everything straight to the police. I knew what they were, on some level I already knew, but I needed to see it myself. I needed to understand who I'd been living with, what had been happening in my own home while I slept upstairs, oblivious. She plugged the first drive into her laptop. The screen flickered, a video file appeared. She clicked on it. The footage was dark at first, grainy, shot in what looked like a small room with concrete walls. Walls she now recognized as being in her own basement, in a section she'd never seen. There was a chair in the center, metal, bolted to the floor. And in that chair, bound and gagged. Linda couldn't continue. She broke down in my office, sobbing so hard she couldn't breathe. Her whole body shook. I waited. I offered her water, tissues, whatever small comforts I could provide. I gave her time. When she finally spoke again, her voice was dead. Flat, emptied of everything except exhaustion. The voice of someone who has seen something that can never be unseen. Something that has fundamentally altered their understanding of the world and their place in it. His voice was on the recording, giving instructions, narrating, enjoying himself. My husband's voice, the voice that had said I love you to me thousands of times, the voice that had read bedtime stories to our children, the voice that had sung hymns in church every Sunday, that voice doing those things to those women. What Linda experienced watching those recordings was a form of psychological annihilation. Everything she believed about her life, her marriage, her judgment, her reality, all of it was destroyed in the span of a few seconds of footage. The man she had loved, trusted, built a life with, raised children with, he didn't exist. He had never existed. He was a mask, a carefully constructed persona worn by something monstrous. The cognitive dissonance that had protected her for so long shattered completely, leaving her exposed to the full horror of her situation. This kind of revelation doesn't just cause trauma, it fundamentally rewrites a person's entire life narrative, forcing them to reinterpret every memory, every moment, through the lens of this terrible new knowledge. Harold was due home in 24 hours. I thought about running, Linda said, packing a bag, getting in the car and just driving until I ran out of road, disappearing like those women had disappeared, except I'd be choosing it, I'd be escaping. She stared at her hands, still raw from washing. But where would I go, and what about the evidence? If I ran, Harold might realize something was wrong. He might destroy everything. Those USB drives, those objects, the room behind the wall, he might make it all vanish. And those women, their families, they deserved to know what happened. They'd been waiting years, some of them decades, for answers. I couldn't let him take that from them too. So she stayed. She put everything back exactly as she'd found it. She cleaned up any trace of her search. She rehearsed her smile in the mirror until it looked natural. And when Harold came home the next evening, she smiled and kissed his cheek and asked about his conference. "How was the presentation on canine cardiac disorders?" she asked, referencing a session she'd found in the conference program online. Harold smiled his warm, familiar smile. "Excellent. Really groundbreaking research." He'd never attended that session, he'd never attended any session. But Linda nodded and smiled and served him the dinner she'd prepared, his favorite pot roast with roasted vegetables, and sat across from him at the table where they'd shared thousands of meals. "That first night was the hardest," she whispered, lying in bed next to him, feeling him breathe, listening to him fall asleep, peaceful and content, while I stared at the ceiling with my heart pounding so loud I was sure he could hear it. She wrapped her arms around herself, as if trying to hold herself together. I kept thinking about Carol, about all of them, about what had happened in that basement room while I slept. Had I heard anything? Had there been sounds I dismissed as the house settling or animals outside? Had I been dreaming peacefully while just below me? She couldn't finish. Some sentences don't need endings. But I had to stay calm. I had to be normal. I had to give him no reason to suspect that anything had changed, because I wasn't done yet. I needed to gather more evidence. I needed to make sure, when I went to the authorities, that there would be no way for him to escape justice. For 5 more days, Linda lived with her husband as if nothing had changed. She cooked his meals, she did his laundry, she watched television with him in the evenings, she lay beside him in bed every night. And every moment she was copying files, photographing evidence, documenting everything she found. Linda's ability to maintain her composure during those 5 days speaks to an incredible survival instinct. The same instinct that allows prey animals to play dead when captured, that enables soldiers to function in combat, that helps victims of abuse navigate their daily lives without alerting their abusers. Her dissociation, the sense of watching herself go through the motions while her true self remained elsewhere, observing, was a protective mechanism that allowed her to function in an impossible situation. But it came at tremendous cost. The psychological toll of pretending normalcy while living with a monster, of kissing the cheek of a serial predator, of lying beside pure evil and feigning sleep. These experiences would leave scars that would take years to heal if they ever fully did. On the 5th day after Harold's return, Linda made her decision. She waited until Harold left for his clinic. She watched his car disappear down the driveway. She counted to 100 slowly, making sure he wasn't coming back for something he'd forgotten. Then she picked up the phone and called the FBI. "I didn't call the local police," she explained to me. Harold knew everyone on the force. He'd treated their dogs, vaccinated their cats, gone to their barbecues. He played golf with the sheriff every month. I didn't know who I could trust go. I didn't know who might warn him. 2 FBI agents arrived within 3 hours. A man and a woman, both in their 40s, both with the calm, professional demeanor of people who had seen terrible things and learned to contain their reactions. Linda showed them everything. The objects in the hidden drawer, the dates, the USB drives she'd copied onto her own storage device, the hidden room behind the basement wall, her own research printed out in a neat folder, connecting each date to a missing or dead woman. The female agent, a woman about Linda's age with kind eyes and graying hair, looked at Linda with something like admiration when she'd finished. "Most people in your situation would have confronted him," she said quietly, "or run or fallen apart. You gathered evidence, systematically, thoroughly. You built a case that will put him away forever. That takes incredible strength." Linda shook her head. "It wasn't strength, it was necessity. Those women deserved justice, their families deserved answers. I couldn't give them their daughters back. I couldn't undo what he did. But I could make sure he never did it again." Linda's focus on the victims rather than herself was both a coping mechanism and a genuine reflection of her moral character. By channeling her energy toward obtaining justice for others, she could temporarily avoid confronting the full weight of her own trauma. This outward focus, this sense of purpose and mission, helped her function in the immediate aftermath of her discovery. But eventually she would need to turn that compassion inward. Eventually she would need to grieve not only for the victims, but for herself, for the marriage she thought she had, for the husband she thought she knew, for the 34 years of her life that had been built on lies. They arrested Harold 3 days later on a clear Tuesday morning. He was at his veterinary clinic, giving a routine vaccination to a golden retriever puppy when the agents walked in. The puppy's owner, a young mother with a toddler on her hip, watched in confusion as they read Harold his rights. Linda wasn't there. She was at home standing at the kitchen window, watching her driveway, waiting. "I saw the news vans before I got the call," she said. "3 of them coming down our road like a parade. That's how fast it spread. The whole town knew within hours." The headlines were relentless. Every newspaper, every news channel, every website seemed to have a different angle on the story. Small-town vet unmasked as serial predator, wife of accused killer. What did she know? The monster next door, 25 years of horror hidden in plain sight. Veterinarian's basement of horrors reveals 7 victims. Linda became a prisoner in her own home. Reporters camped on her lawn, shouting questions whenever she appeared to window. Her phone rang constantly with calls from journalists, true crime podcasters, documentary producers. Her email filled with messages, some supportive, many accusing. A few so vile that the FBI advised her to stop reading them. "How could you not know?" they asked. "You must have seen something. You were probably involved. You're as guilty as he is." Her children flew in from their respective cities. Michael, the eldest, took charge, hiring security, handling the media, arranging for Linda to stay at a hotel under an assumed name. David helped pack the essentials from the house, now a crime scene crawling with forensic investigators. But Sarah, Linda's middle child, her only connection to a daughter she'd never had, wouldn't look at her mother. "She thinks I knew," Linda said, her voice cracking. "She thinks I was protecting him. She said she can't trust anything I've ever told her. If I could live with a monster for 34 years without knowing, what else might I have missed? What else might I have lied about?" A tear slid down Linda's cheek. "My own daughter, my Sarah, looking at me like I was a stranger, like I was complicit in something unspeakable." Sarah's reaction, while devastating to Linda, was psychologically understandable. Children, even adult children, look to their parents as their primary source of truth about the world. When a parent's judgment is revealed to be so catastrophically wrong, it destabilizes the child's entire sense of reality. Sarah wasn't just angry at her mother, she was grappling with the terrifying possibility that nothing she believed about her family, her childhood, her own instincts, might be reliable. Her rejection of Linda was, at its core, a desperate attempt to re-establish some sense of control in a world that had suddenly become incomprehensible. Facing the families, the investigation revealed the full scope of Harold's crimes. 7 women over 25 years. The hidden room in the basement had been soundproofed, accessible only through a trapdoor concealed beneath the flooring. A trapdoor hidden under a rug that Linda had vacuumed around for decades without ever moving. She had walked over that trapdoor hundreds of times, Thousands of times, she had never known what lay beneath her feet. The families of the victims reached out, one by one. Some sent letters filled with rage, pages and pages demanding to know how she could not have seen, how she could have lived with a monster, how she could have raised children with a murderer while their daughters lay in unmarked graves. Others sent messages of gratitude. Thank you, Fu, for going to the authorities. Thank you for being brave enough to turn him in. Thank you for finally giving us answers. Carol's mother was among the latter. She called me, Linda said, tears streaming down her face. 82 years old, she'd spent 17 years not knowing what happened to her daughter. 17 years of hoping Carol was alive somewhere, living a new life. 17 years of wondering if she'd said something wrong, done something to drive her daughter away. Linda's voice broke. She thanked me. She actually thanked me. She said at least now she could grieve properly. At least now she knew Carol hadn't abandoned her. Carol had loved her until the very end. Linda paused, gathering herself. And then she asked me to describe the earrings, because she wanted to make sure they were really Carol's. I described them, the little silver hoops with the tiny diamond chips, the way one of them had a slight bend in the post because Carol had slept on it wrong once, and she made this sound I'll never forget. 17 years of grief, compressed into one terrible sound. A mother's heart breaking all over again. Linda's experience with Carol's mother illustrates the complex web of trauma that extends from crimes like Harold's. The elderly woman's grief, frozen for 17 years by uncertainty and false hope, could finally begin to thaw and process. But that processing meant accepting a truth even more terrible than the not knowing. It meant burying a daughter for real after 17 years of imagining her alive. For Linda, being the messenger of that truth, being the one to confirm that her friend's mother's worst fears were not only justified, but exceeded, added another layer to her own burden. She had become, in some sense, the voice of the dead. Harold's trial lasted 4 months. It was a media sensation, cameras outside the courthouse, daily coverage on national news, true crime podcasts analyzing every piece of evidence. Linda testified 3 times, once about her discovery, once about their marriage, once about the day of the arrest. Throughout the trial, Harold maintained his innocence. He claimed the evidence was planted. He claimed Linda was mentally unstable, once bitter about their marriage, seeking revenge for imagined slights. He claimed he was being framed by the FBI, by the media, by a society that couldn't believe a respected veterinarian could be anything other than what he appeared. His defense attorney questioned Linda's sanity on the stand, asked if she had a history of mental illness, asked if she had ever taken psychiatric medication, asked if she might have fabricated the entire story because she was jealous of the attention Harold gave to his career. Sitting in that courtroom, looking at him, Linda said, was the hardest thing I've ever done. He looked so normal, so bewildered, so wrongly accused. His voice was steady, his answers were calm and reasonable. And part of me, God help me, part of me almost believed him. That's how good he was at pretending. Even knowing what I knew, even having seen what I'd seen, some tiny part of me still wanted to believe it was all a terrible mistake. The jury didn't share her doubt. They deliberated for 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. 7 counts of first-degree murder, multiple counts of kidnapping, multiple counts of aggravated assault. Harold was sentenced to 7 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. As he was led from the courtroom, Harold turned to look at Linda one last time. She made herself meet his eyes, made herself hold his gaze, made herself see him, really see him, for what he was. "You should have stayed upstairs," he said. His voice was calm, almost pleasant, as if he were reminding her to pick up milk on the way home. That was the last thing he ever said to her. Harold's final words were chilling in their implication. "You should have stayed upstairs." Wasn't a threat or an expression of regret. It was a statement of ownership, a final assertion of control. Even in defeat, he was reminding Linda that she had violated his domain, crossed a boundary he had established. To the very end, he saw her not as a person with agency and moral courage, but as an object that had failed to remain in its designated place. This kind of dehumanization is characteristic of predators. They view their partners like their victims, as things to be controlled and used rather than people to be loved and respected. Linda and I have been working together for 3 months now. The nightmares come less frequently than they did at first. The compulsive hand-washing has stopped. Her skin has finally begun to heal, though faint scars remain. She's moved to a small cottage by the sea, far from the town where she spent her married life, far from the house that will forever be known as the House of Horrors. Her relationship with her children is slowly, painfully healing. Michael visits every other weekend. Thomas calls every Sunday without fail, sometimes just to say hello, sometimes to talk for hours. Their conversations are awkward sometimes, strained by unspoken questions, but they're happening. That's what matters. And Sarah is still struggling. The anger hasn't faded. The trust hasn't returned. But last week, for the first time since the arrest, she sent Linda a text message. Just 2 words appearing on the screen at 2 a.m. "I'm trying. That's more than I dared hope for," Linda told me, crying and smiling at the same time. That unique expression of joy and sorrow mingled together. I know I may never get my daughter back completely. I know there's a part of her that will always wonder, always doubt, but she's trying. And as long as she's trying, there's hope. In our last session, I asked Linda what she wanted people to understand about her experience. She thought for a long moment before answering, choosing her words with care. "People ask me how I didn't know," she said, "and I don't have a good answer for them. I can explain about psychological manipulation, about betrayal blindness, about how predators construct elaborate masks, but none of that feels like enough. The truth is, I loved him, I trusted him, I built a life with him, and none of that was real. The man I loved never existed. I was married to a ghost, a fiction, a carefully crafted lie." She paused, steadying her breath. "But here's what I want people to know. Not knowing isn't a crime. Living with evil without recognizing it isn't a moral failing. We're not equipped to see monsters when they look like the people we love. The only crime is knowing and doing nothing." Her eyes met mine, and in them I saw something I hadn't seen in our earlier sessions. Peace. Not happiness. Not yet, maybe not ever, but a kind of acceptance. A settling. "And when I knew," she continued, "I didn't do nothing. I didn't run. I didn't confront him and give him a chance to escape. I gathered evidence. I went to the FBI. I testified at his trial. I got justice for those women. It doesn't erase the 34 years. It doesn't bring anyone back, but it's something. It's the only something I could do." Linda's words reflect a profound psychological truth that I wish more people understood. We cannot blame ourselves for what we didn't know. The human mind is not equipped to detect sophisticated deception, especially from those we love and trust most completely. What matters our character, is what we do when the truth finally reaches us. Linda chose action over paralysis, justice over silence, the victims over her in comfort and safety. That choice doesn't undo the past, doesn't erase the years of unwitting complicity, but it does define who she is. Not as the wife of a monster, not as a woman who failed to see, but as a woman who, when faced with unimaginable horror, found the courage to do what was right. Linda's story stays with me. Not because of its horror. I've heard many horrific stories in my career, stories that would keep most people awake for weeks. It stays with me because of her courage, the courage to look in that basement when every instinct told her to stay upstairs. The courage to search for the truth when ignorance would have been so much easier. The courage to act on what she found, even knowing it would destroy her life as she knew it. The courage to testify against the man she had loved, in front of cameras and reporters, and a world eager to judge her. The courage to rebuild slowly and painfully from the ashes of everything she once believed. She lost her marriage, she lost her home, she lost her reputation, she nearly lost her relationship with her daughter, she lost her sense of trust in others, in herself, in her own judgment. But she gained something too. She gained the knowledge that when it mattered most, she chose truth over comfort, she chose justice over silence, she chose the victims over her own peace of mind. Not everyone would have made that choice, not everyone would have had the strength. Linda did. That's who she is. That's who she's always been. She just didn't know it until the night the power went out and she descended those basement stairs, flashlight in hand, to find a small silver key that would unlock the darkest secret imaginable. I hope this story has helped you see your own life, your own feelings, or the people around you from a different perspective. I hope it has helped you understand yourself and others a little better. I would love to hear something about you in the comments, to get to know you and your story a little more. If you want to share what's inside you, you can write to the email address in my profile. And if this story touched you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. To be notified of the next true story, click the bell icon to turn on notifications. Before we end, I want to ask you a few questions. Take a moment to think about them. What do you think about Linda's story? Does her experience remind you of anything in your own life or in the lives of people you know? Have you ever trusted someone completely, only to discover they weren't who you thought they were? Do you believe Linda should have known something was wrong? Or do you believe that deception this sophisticated can truly be invisible to those closest to the deceiver? Is it fair to expect someone to see what a predator works so hard to hide? If you were in Linda's position, if you discovered something this terrible about your partner, what would you do? Would you have the courage to stay calm, gather evidence, and go to the authorities? Or would the horror overwhelm you? What would you say to Linda if you could speak to her directly? And what would you say to her daughter Sarah, who is still struggling to forgive her mother for something that wasn't her fault? And finally, do you believe that not knowing can ever truly be forgiven, by others or by ourselves? Is there a point where ignorance stops being an excuse and becomes complicity? Or is that line something only each individual can draw for themselves? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. Your perspective matters. Your voice matters. Until next time, take care of yourselves and take care of each other.